Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Cadillac Gage V100 M706 Armored car. Since the last video update, this model now has been painted and the markings have been applied. We'll be going over all of the steps and other various tips that went into bringing the model up to the condition that you see here in this video. So stay tuned because there's going to be a bit of info coming right at you. Picking up where we left off from the last video update, the model, as I mentioned before, was ready for painting and had the last of the external details fabricated, or at least that's what I originally thought. One very small little bit of detailing that I forgot to add was this little tie-down footman loop that's right over here on top of the jerry can holder. On the V100, there is a small little footman loop right over here, and the job of this is to add extra tension to the nylon strap that holds the jerry can in place. With the wacky angle here of this rear plate, if the jerry can is held on in place, you're going to see that it's going to be top heavy, specifically once it's full with fuel or water or whatever substance is inside of it. Well, in order to give just a little bit more extra support and structure, an extra tie-down loop is right over here on the top portion, and then the nylon strap runs through everything, and once everything is strapped down, it gives it much more support and it holds it better in a much stronger way. In order to fabricate the loop, this is the same procedure that I've done on many other 1/6 scale models, from the M10 Tank destroyer to my M4 Sherman series, and that is by fabricating it out of the following format. The loop itself is made from a bit of floor wire that's bent to shape, and then I drill two small indentations into the rear plate itself. Once those holes are carefully drilled and marked, the unit is bent to shape and then glued to the appropriate location. Although, unlike those other examples, well, not so much the M10, but definitely on the Shermans, where I just go directly through the plate because there's no interior detailing on the inside, for this one here, I can't really do that because, as we can recall, on the opposite side of this large duct over here, there is some interior detailing, and it would be a bit of an eyesore. So the holes are only drilled part way through. This is basically the same type of circumstances as we saw on the M10 Tank destroyers, which has the exact same type of detailing and the exact same conundrum. Only on that vehicle, it's found on the turret, and obviously with being an open top configuration, you don't want to have any holes popping through the opposite side. After the piece is bent to shape and glued in place, the next thing to do is to sculpt the two foot loops that you see on either side. This is done with my two-part epoxy. I go ahead, mix the stuff together, and then I sculpt it to the appropriate location. Once everything is set, dry, and painted, it'll just blend right in, and the piece will look like one piece that was actually bent to shape and then welded to the model. Or I should say welded to the vehicle. On the model over here, the reason why I go with this type of format is because this is the strongest way to do it. If I just take a piece of wire, bend it to shape, flatten the ends on the vise, and basically just glue it to the model, exterior-wise, it'll look basically on point. However, it is much more frail and fragile compared to actually having it plugged into the model. And with this setup over here, when it comes time to install the jerry can permanently, I am going to be utilizing the strap system, and it is actually going to be holding on to the unit with a little bit of structure. So I need to have the unit be as strong as possible, so we went with the following format, aside from it also looking better compared to the manufacturing method that I touched upon before. Now that the unit is fitted in place, at this point here, yeah, it's actually ready for painting, or specifically the hull. This here is also a sight that hasn't been seen in a number of video updates, where the model now has its wheels being removed. The reason why I'm doing this is, again, for painting. I don't want to get any paint onto the wheels themselves, and this is easier to mask up without the units mounted in place. Plus, the wheels need to be washed, cleaned. They do have a bunch of dust and other just crud on them that I want to thoroughly remove prior to the thing heading off into completion, and this is best done with them removed. Also, without the tires in place, this makes masking a bit easier. To remove the tires, well, I basically just undo what I did in the earlier video update. The wheels are held on with lug nuts as they are on the real vehicle, and I just basically take my wrench, undo the bolts, and the entire wheel just slides off, much along the lines as you saw the one over here. And I'm pretty sure the NASCAR or Indy pit crews would have been happy with that tire removal. But here you get to see the tire removed. And this is what I was talking about, where it had a lot of crud and stuff just on the surface and it needs to go. This is construction powder, or construction dust is what I refer to around the shop. And it's just basically slurry from when I was doing the body work before. And this is red putty dust. It's mixed in with water from the wet sanding. And as you can see, it's pretty nasty. Fortunately, it's just superficial. It'll just wash right off with some water and with a paintbrush, a stiff bristle one. I just go in there and scrub this crap off, and then the tire will be good, clean, and ready to go. With the model now back in Camden, New Jersey mode, I went ahead and off camera took care of the cleanup. When you're doing a build like this, the inside fills up with crap very easily, and this is basically things like ground chunks of plastic, bodywork, chips of epoxy. All that nasty particulate always ends up on the inside just from the, general construction of a model like this. And even though this model does not have an interior, it just makes it just so much better to clean your inside, specifically before the thing goes off into paint. To do this, I took the model outdoors, opened up all the hatches, took the turret off, and with my compressed air blowgun, I stuck it on the inside, and I just kept on blowing and blowing and blowing. With all of the hatches open, all that crap just blew out, and, since it was done outdoors, it didn't make a mess of the shop. You can also use a vacuum to do this, and I have done that in the past. However, the vacuum does a decent job, but it doesn't really get everything out. Not nearly as good as just blowing it out with the air gun physically. Once the interior was cleaned out, I went ahead and closed all the hatches, and I hit the outside with the same air gun in order to make sure that there's no dust left on the surface. But as a step further, one procedure that I like to do on my 1/6 scale builds, specifically the static ones, is I hit the external surfaces with the hose. The garden hose just blasts the surfaces, and this will actually do a great job on cleaning any sort of particulate and dust that's still on the surface, making sure that the surface is nice and smooth, and it's then at that point ready for paint. I also want to point out that it is July when I'm filming this video, so it's super easy and nice to go outdoors, wash this thing down, and then wait for the sun to dry it up in no time. The same exact procedure is a bit trickier to do, obviously, in the winter months, specifically here in the Northeast where I live. And, yeah, it's not really that fun to do, but I have done it and will continue to do it because, the show must go on and I got to get builds done. So, once the model is thoroughly dried off, oh, by the way, when it's dry, you will get water on the inside. It's, inevitable. Open up the hatches, drain it out, and just let the thing aerate for a little bit. In the summer months, it dries up fairly quickly. You don't want to keep the whole thing in direct sunlight because it is plastic, and that can have detrimental effects. But regardless, once the thing is fully dried out, I brought it back in the shop, and then it's ready for the next step, which is the masking. Even though this model does not have a full interior detailing, I did go ahead and mask up the periscopes in the following manner. The reason why I did this is because I just don't want to have paint get on the inside, and also I don't want any potential paint to swirl around and get into the turret, which does have its interior detailing, not to mention the interior portion of the hatches, which again have their interior painting and weathering already completed. On the V100 over here, there are lots of cutouts for the periscope prisms, and in order to close these off, I just took some masking tape and stuck it on the inside, leaving for the presentation that we have here. On the hatches, I stuffed the prism areas with tissue paper, or I should say paper towel. And this was done on all of the hatches on the sides and also the rear portion of the vehicle. The pistol ports aren't a problem. They are functional, however, they stay closed pretty well, and this is something that's not necessarily going to flop around during the painting process. The biggest work with the masking was indeed with the turret. I went ahead and had to carefully mask up the inner portions here of the turret prisms. Unlike the hull where you can stick the tape on the inside and be good with it, on the turret over here it's not possible because of the depth of the periscope box. So on the turret over here I had to do it the old-fashioned way, where I took masking tape over here, put it onto the window, and then with a pencil I basically scribed the lines on the inner portion here of the scope, peeled it off, cut it out with a scissor carefully, and then meticulously put each one of these masks in place. This was aided with the use of a little paint spatula that I have over here, but you could also use a tweezer. In fact, I did before I found my paint spatula. You put the unit in place, and then you just, go and seal off the edges here with the spatula, and since it's a nice dull surface, it'll help contort the tape exactly to where it needs to be. At this point here, the turret is all sealed up and it's ready to go. Obviously, the MG ports were plugged up with the tissue paper for reasons that should be fairly obvious. At this point, I also want to touch upon the fact that all of the hatches are buttoned up at this point as well, including the one here for the turret. This thing ain't going nowhere at this time. Same is also true for the two here on the side. As you can see, this thing is all ready to go. I am going to go through the opening and closing hatch procedure later on as the series progresses towards the end, because there actually is a format on how to open this thing up with the hatches all buttoned up, but that's something that I'm going to be mentioning at a later date. The last of the masking is going to be done to the wheel well areas over here. I'm going to take care of that off camera. The reason why I'm taking care of that, because while the entire lower hull and the wheel well areas have been thoroughly painted and weathered previously in the earlier stages of the model's construction, so getting paint into these areas over here is going to be rather anticlimactic. So I'm going to go ahead and thoroughly mask those up, and they should be good to go. The next thing I want to mention in terms of paint itself, before I go ahead and throw the base coat on this thing, I do have to mention the primer. No matter the scale of the model, be it large scale or small scale, you need primer on the surface. It always helps and it's beneficial for getting the paint to stick, and the paint just looks so much better when the model's painted, regardless of the media of paint or even the make of paint that you prefer. On this model over here, you'll see that the surfaces have already been pre-primed in the earlier portions of this model's construction. So the primer on this model is not going to be as over-encompassing as it is on, say, the King Tiger that I recently completed. On this one here, it's only going to be localized on certain areas that have yet to be primed. Things like the headlights, the side view mirrors, and, you know, the MG mount here on the back. That's really it. The rest of the unit, it's going to be pretty much good to go in this type of format, and the paint will just go over these primered surfaces without any sort of issues. One other thing about the masking that I just remembered is that the back section over here definitely needs to be masked up. As we recall, there is interior detailing in this section over here, and I definitely do not want any sort of overspray ruining the detailing that I did earlier. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, the mesh here is not glued on in a permanent manner, or at least not yet anyhow, and it just lifts off, which allows me to mask it as I originally intended. This guy here is already painted and weathered for that matter, so this guy here can just sit this one out, and I could then catch up to him with the remainder of the paintwork when he gets completed. And here's the model now with its base coat added. For the paintwork, I use my usual format on my models, specifically my 1/6 scale ones, where the paint is my exterior flat latex right here. This is a shade of post 1950s, 1960s dark U.S. Army olive drab. This is a color that I cobbled together myself, and I've utilized it on a few other builds that have been seen on this channel in the past, mostly in 135. This is actually the first time I've utilized this color on a 1/6 scale vehicle. The paint is all applied with my spray gun, and I use the Harbor Freight Special that I picked up a few months ago. And it worked like a charm on this build over here. As long as you have a good air compressor, you should have some pretty decent results with a unit like this. On the color, when it comes to these Vietnam-era vehicles, there were such a wide range of different shades of olive drab that were utilized, because you had not just olive drab, but you also had some tropical green type colors, which were also in the U.S. inventory mix, and that's also difference between U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps, but, you know, it just opens up a litany of possible avenues in which to paint it. For this one here, I was really inspired by the one here on the cover of the new Vanguard book. That's basically more or less the look that I'm going for with this one over here, and you can really see that the colors are really starting to shape up. From here, I'm going to go ahead and peel off the mask that I added to the wheel well that I mentioned earlier. And then from there, I can start the application of the washes and all the other little effects that are used to bring the model up to the final form in terms of its paintwork. With the model's base coat out of the way, it's time now to put on probably my favorite part of these builds, and that's the markings. So unlike a 1/35 scale tank where you have, you know, the little decals and you put them in water and slide them on and all that good stuff, for 1/6 scale, well, you have to do things a little bit differently, shall we say. So on all of my 1/6 scale builds, I like to apply the markings with stencils, okay? You're applying the markings on with paint, and it's the best way to achieve the most realistic effect. As again, on the real vehicles, they're applied in the exact same manner. So it's one of those things where if you're doing a 1/6 scale build and you're going through these type of steps, the realism and accuracy just tends to come naturally. The stencils that are on my models are all custom made per build, and this is something that's, you know, lends itself for the most amount of flexibility, because you can basically have a blank slate, blank canvas, and put the markings on any way you desire. For my markings, I always lay them up in Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop, and then I just go ahead, size them up, and print them out. The stencils are printed out on sticker paper. These are the type of things you find in any office supply store. However, in the past, I went ahead and did it in a slightly different way. And this build here is truly the first time I'm actually applying the stencils, utilizing a tool that I didn't have access to before. So in the past, like here I have my sticker paper here, and you can see there's a cutout here of a star. On past builds, I would go ahead and print this out just with my standard laser printer, and then I would carefully, meticulously, with a sharper X-Acto, cut out every single line here on the star or whatever marking that I need in order to get the stencil cut out and then secured to the model. For this one, however, I'm utilizing a new tool. You see, for the Christmas holiday, me and my sister chipped in and bought my mother a Cricut machine because she does stuff on Etsy, and, you know, it was a cool little thing that me and my sister got her. Well, I was looking at that machine, I'm thinking to myself, you know, why am I doing everything the hard way? Let me go ahead and see if I could utilize this technology in this machine for my stencil needs. And so far, it's working like a charm. I went ahead and laid up the markings as I do normally in Adobe Photoshop. I then went ahead and export them as an SVG, opened up the Cricut software, and after a minute or two of using the software for the first time, I was able to get everything printed out appropriately. For the star and the military police banner over here, that was easy enough. However, where it's going to become really handy is where it has the military police as well as the TO&E markings. These are something that in the past would have been driving me up the wall trying to carefully cut out with a X-Acto. I have done it, so I know it can be done, but having done it so often, now having access to a machine that can do it for me, it definitely makes things up much easier affair. So needless to say, I think I'm going to be messing around with this machine for the next foreseeable future on my 1/6 scale build, so stay tuned for that. Back to this one over here, I went ahead and am currently applying on the stencils in order to apply the markings. As I always mention, the paint is applied via the airbrush. It's a great way to have the most amount of precision and control when applying something like this. You can use spray paint. That is something I have done in the past, but in my opinion, the airbrush just makes the job a little bit easier. In addition to that, the biggest thing that you need to pay attention to any stenciling is overspray, and it's one of those things where if you have a slight little gap or the mask isn't big enough, the overspray will somehow find its way to that area, and you're going to have to now try to, mask everything up and touch it up again. So it's a huge pain. So what I'm going to do now is I only have these two markings up at this time. I'm actually going to basically seal the entire side here of the vehicle with paper and masks and other sorts of blockages in order to prevent any sort of seepage running through. But anyway, this is how the markings are going to be applied on this model, and let's circle back to when these markings are applied. So here I am putting on the last of the stencils for this model, or at least at this time. It's the verbiage that says military police, and the Cricut machine is better than I can ever have anticipated. It is awesome. If you have the know-how with using graphic design software, the Cricut machine is definitely a must-have bit of equipment. Within about like an hour or so, I was able to make all of my stencils from just taking the machine out of the box for the first time, plugging it in, to having fully completed stencils. It was really quick, easy. I only wish homebrew 3D printers were that efficient. The stencil cutting is absolutely perfect. It cleanly and effortlessly cuts everything out to the point where you get to see the remaining of the letters here on the backing. It just peels right off. And one thing that I'm able to do with this that I was not able to do with the old-fashioned way was with the inner areas, such as the things on the O's, the P's, and the R's, and even the A's. On previous builds, this is something I would just have to leave off and then carefully paint on with a paintbrush. However, on this over here, I just simply peel it off of the backing with a very fine tweezer and just drop it directly into place. It is a little bit tedious, but it's definitely a lot easier compared to trying to redraw it with a paintbrush. So this is something that so far has been absolutely worth its weight of gold, and I cannot wait to utilize this machine on future builds in various scales. So stay tuned for that. Right now, I'm actually just putting on the paper, or I should say the overspray protection, which is just being used, or I should say, which is just being made out of some pieces of masking tape here that were from other stencils that have already been applied. It's a great way to recycle the masking tape, and it cuts down on the waist. So, as you can see, this here was the one from the opposite side. You may be tempted to try to recycle the stencil, and you may be able to do that. However, since I already had the stencil already cut, might as well just roll with it. Use the fresh one. Then from here, I'm just going to go ahead and add the remaining of the tape. Very sticky job, but, it's definitely worth it. The key when you're lining up the stencils, of course, is make sure that that everything is squared and where it needs to be. And on this one over here, because it has that white box behind it, it's actually even more important than a regular type of marking. But keep in mind, on the real ones, these were applied by a bunch of dudes, basically much along the same lines as I'm doing it now. So you do have some leeway on, some, alignment. Obviously, you don't want to be too wonky with it, but, you do have some artistic licensing, I should say, in how everything should be applied. Okay, to apply the paint, this is done with the airbrush. I have here to me a flat black. I'm just going to go ahead and carefully get everything painted on. Make sure that the stencil is nice and flat. And that's it. From here, I'm just going to let it sit, let it dry, and then I'll go ahead and peel it off for the final reveal. So here's the vehicle now with the government markings applied. And as you can see, it's looking very, very sharp. But the markings are not complete just yet. The last marking I'm going to put on is the vehicle's name. Now, of course, one thing that I like to do on my American builds is I always give them a name or a cartoon character, something to give the model a little bit of character. And on this model here, it's going to be no exception. However, unlike the vehicles from World War II, where the crew markings and insignias were on the, shall we say, simplistic side, or more or less, for the Vietnam War period, that was definitely not the case, and these vehicles had some really crazy and ornate markings and drawings painted on them, and for this vehicle here, that's part of the fun. The V100s in particular in Vietnam were really well known for having some very elaborate artwork and graffiti painted on them by the crews. One division, or I should say one platoon in particular, had all of the Marvel characters painted on, from Iron Man to the Hulk to Thor and so on and so forth. For me on this one, I'm not going to be going with anything from Marvel. I'm going to do something a little bit different, but it's definitely something that's going to be from the same era, and you'll see that momentarily. But before I do that, I might as well go ahead and show one last look of the model in this configuration, in its, shall we say, government configuration. And after a few brushstrokes later, here you get to see what the paint job looks like with the name and the character applied. Obviously, for this vehicle here, I went with the 1960s cartoon character Underdog, which is a perfect subject matter for this vehicle and also for the time period that this vehicle does represent. As for the paintwork, the logo was done with the stencil technique that I mentioned earlier. This was drawn in Adobe Illustrator. I went ahead and scaled it to the appropriate size, printed it out, ran it through the Cricut machine, then I airbrushed it onto the model. After the mask were peeled, the strokes were added with the paintbrush, and that was all done by hand. For the character himself, this was not utilizing stencils. In fact, this was done the old school way, where I went ahead and hand drew everything and then hand painted everything to the configuration that you see here. And it's reasons like this why I personally have so much fun with working on American tanks in 1/6 scale. This is the type of artwork that you really don't necessarily see very often on the other vehicles from the other countries, specifically in the past. And this is specifically true for the Germans, but it's also relevant for the Russians and the Brits. Although the Russians, they just tend to have lots of, patriotic slogans scribbled on the side, and the Germans tend to be a little bit more conservative. I know, surprising for the Germans, when they if they have anything in a logo or a slogan type manner, it's generally just some text with, a woman's name or something similar. But the Americans, yeah, we like to put graffiti on our vehicles, and we're just, fans of pop culture, so it's not uncommon to see comic book characters or pinups or other things like that on our vehicles. And in the 1960s, yeah, this just blew up way more, like I mentioned before, compared to the, World War II era. As for the actual painting technique here, this is something that I perfected about almost 20 years ago now, where I actually did a logo similar to this, almost identical to this really, on a 1/6 scale M5A1 Stuart that I built in my collection, and only that one I painted and I named the vehicle Mighty Mouse, and that can be found on the ECA website. I built that model, you know, long before I started doing the YouTube stuff, but the images are still found on the ECA website and can be found in the link below. And I also utilize the same exact techniques like a couple years later on a 1/6 scale M10 Tank destroyer that I built named Joe Palooka. Again, named after a comic book character of that era. And, you know, it's one of those type of tactics where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I utilize the exact same techniques with the model that we have here. Everything was, again, hand-drawn with a pencil, and then everything was just painted on with the paintbrush and to get the results that you see presently. And I think this one just looks absolutely awesome, and it's going to be a great addition to my collection once it's fully completed. As I mentioned in a previous video, this project here is on a rocket sled blasting towards the finish line at Mach 2, and with the model painted and with the markings applied, you really get to see exactly how far down the road it really is. From this point onward, the model is going to head off into weathering. Then once the weathering is completed, it's time for the fun part, which means adding on all of the final details to the model in a permanent manner. This would include the wheels, the headlights, the taillights, the mirrors, the MGs, the antennas, all of that cool fun stuff. However, that's going to be information I'm going to be mentioning in the next project update video, which should hopefully be posted shortly after this one here. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale Cadillac Gage V100 M706 Armored car. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a fantastic way to keep in the loop of new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.